There comes a moment in every generation when faith stops being theoretical and starts being tested, when belief is no longer something you assume about yourself and becomes something you must consciously choose. We're approaching one of those moments. And after January 3rd, 2026, something subtle but unmistakable will begin to happen among those who call themselves Christians. It won't arrive with sirens or headlines. It won't announce itself on the news. It will unfold quietly, steadily, and deeply, right in the hearts of people who sit in the same churches, read the same scriptures, and use the same language, but are living very different spiritual realities. For years, Christianity in many places has been comfortable. It has been culturally acceptable, socially safe, and often convenient. You could identify as a Christian without it costing you much. You could blend in, go along, nod your head, and still feel spiritually secure. Faith fit neatly into life instead of reshaping it. But seasons change, and what is coming is a season of separation. Not a separation created by churches or denominations, but one revealed by conviction. What will become clear is the difference between cultural Christianity and convicted faith. Cultural Christianity is inherited, habitual, and often shallow. Convicted faith is chosen, tested, and rooted. Cultural Christianity asks, how does faith fit into my life? Convicted faith asks, how does my life submit to God? Cultural Christianity thrives when following God is popular. Convicted faith remains when obedience becomes costly. After this threshold, the pressure of the world will no longer allow faith to remain casual. Beliefs that were once tolerated will be challenged. Biblical convictions that were once quietly accepted will be questioned, criticized, and sometimes mocked. And in that moment, everyone will have to decide whether their faith is an accessory or an anchor. You see, pressure has a way of revealing what comfort conceals. When life is easy, anyone can claim belief. When obedience costs something, only the convinced remain. The days ahead will expose whether faith was built on preference or on truth. And that exposure, while uncomfortable, is necessary. Because God has never been interested in crowds that follow Him casually. He has always been after hearts that follow Him completely. This separation won't be loud, but it will be unmistakable. Some will drift quietly away, not because God has changed, but because the cost of following Him no longer aligns with their desires. Others will press deeper, not because it is easy, but because they know there is no alternative. The same pressure that pushes one person out will pull another person in closer. And here is what we must understand. This is not a failure of the church. It is a refinement of the church. Refinement always looks like loss before it looks like strength. When impurities are removed, what remains becomes purer, stronger, and more valuable. God is not shrinking His people. He is strengthening them. In seasons like this, faith stops being inherited and starts being intentional. You won't be able to live off someone else's relationship with God. You won't be able to borrow conviction from a pastor, a parent, or a church culture. Each believer will have to know why they believe what they believe. Not because it sounds right, but because it is rooted in truth. Many have grown up around Christianity without ever being transformed by it. They know the songs, but not surrender. They know the language, but not the lifestyle. They know the routines, but not the relationship. And when following Christ begins to cost reputation, comfort, or security, surface-level faith will quietly dissolve. But those with convicted faith will stand, not arrogantly, not loudly, but firmly. Their strength won't come from argument, but from assurance. They won't need to defend God angrily because they trust Him deeply. They will understand that faithfulness is not proven by applause, but by obedience when no one is clapping. This separation will also change how Christians see themselves. No longer will faith be defined by what church you attend, what label you claim, or how spiritual you appear. Faith will be measured by obedience when it's inconvenient, integrity when it's costly, and trust when the future feels uncertain. There will be moments when standing for truth feels lonely, moments when silence would be easier than conviction, moments when compromise would seem like wisdom. But convicted faith understands something cultural Christianity never learns. Obedience is always safer than compromise, even when it feels riskier. And make no mistake, This separation is not about perfection. God is not looking for flawless people. He is looking for faithful ones, those who stumble but return, those who struggle but remain surrendered, those who wrestle with doubt but refuse to walk away. Convicted faith is not the absence of questions. It is the refusal to abandon God because of them. As the line becomes clearer, something else will happen. The faith of the convinced will grow deeper, not louder. Prayer will become less performative and more desperate. Scripture will become less inspirational and more foundational. Worship will become less about atmosphere and more about surrender. Faith will move from being something you do to something you live. And this will affect families, relationships, and daily decisions. Choices will be filtered through conviction rather than convenience. Entertainment, priorities, habits, and values will be examined, not to earn salvation, but because salvation changes how you live. When faith is real, it shows up everywhere. Some will say the church is becoming smaller, but God has never measured his work by numbers alone. He measures it by faithfulness. Gideon didn't need more soldiers, he needed committed ones. Jesus didn't chase crowds, he called disciples. And in every generation, God has done his greatest work through a remnant that refused to bow to pressure. The beauty of this separation is that it will bring clarity. No more confusion about where you stand, no more drifting on borrowed beliefs, no more living in the gray space between belief and obedience. Convicted faith brings peace, even when it brings challenge, because you are no longer divided within yourself. And for those who choose conviction, there will be a quiet confidence. Not because they feel strong, but because they know whom they trust. Not because they understand everything ahead, but because they know the one who holds the future. This season will remind believers that Christianity was never meant to be safe. It was meant to be saving, never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be transforming. Never meant to blend in, it was meant to stand out. And as the dust settles, what remains will be a church that may be smaller in number but stronger in spirit. Less visible in culture but more powerful in prayer. Less celebrated by the world but more aligned with heaven. Because when faith is no longer convenient, only the convinced will remain. And that is exactly where God does his greatest work as the DA. Move forward beyond that moment we keep talking about. Something else will become impossible to ignore. The pressure will increase, not overnight, not all at once, but steadily, persistently, like a tightening grip. And for many believers, that sounds frightening at first. Pressure rarely feels like a gift. Pressure feels heavy. It feels uncomfortable. It feels unfair. But here is the truth we must understand. If we are going to walk into what is coming without fear, pressure does not destroy genuine faith. It reveals it. And even more than that, pressure brings clarity. For a long time, there has been a kind of spiritual fog, many voices claiming truth, many paths claiming to lead to God, many beliefs blending together until conviction feels optional and discernment feels judgmental. In that fog, it has been easy to stay undecided, to remain vague, to avoid drawing lines. But pressure has a way of clearing the air. When the cost rises, confusion falls. When the stakes become real, choices become clear. What is coming is not just opposition, it is exposure. Beliefs that were once held loosely will be tested. Convictions that were once theoretical will be challenged in real-life situations. Faith will be pressed out of the abstract and into daily decisions. And under that pressure, many will discover what they truly believe, not what they say they believe, not what they were raised to believe, but what they are willing to live for. We need to say this plainly. Increased pressure does not mean God is absent. In fact, throughout Scripture, pressure often signals that God is at work. Think about it. Gold is not purified by comfort. Diamonds are not formed by ease. Muscles are not strengthened without resistance. And faith, real faith, has never grown in seasons of spiritual convenience. The pressure believers will feel will come from many directions. Cultural pressure, conform. Moral pressure to compromise. Social pressure to stay silent. Relational pressure to avoid discomfort. There will be subtle moments and obvious ones, quiet decisions and public stands, and each moment will ask the same question: will you follow God when it costs you something? What will surprise many is that as pressure increases, clarity will increase alongside it. Believers will begin to see more clearly what matters and what does not. Arguments that once seemed confusing will lose their power. Distractions that once felt important will lose their appeal. When faith is tested, it becomes focused. You see, confusion thrives in comfort, but clarity thrives under conviction. When everything is allowed, nothing feels urgent. When every belief is treated as equal, truth feels negotiable. But when pressure demands a decision, truth stands out. Conviction sharpens vision. This clarity will not make life easier, but it will make it simpler. Choices will still be hard, but they will be clearer. The question will no longer be, what do I prefer? But what does obedience require? And that shift changes everything. Some will discover that what they called faith was actually agreement. Agreement is easy. Faith is costly. Agreement nods its head. Faith moves its feet. Agreement survives discussion. Faith survives difficulty. And under pressure, agreement dissolves, but faith remains. There will be moments when believers are misunderstood, when obedience is labeled intolerance, when conviction is called extremism, when standing firm is described as being out of touch. And in those moments, pressure will tempt believers to soften their stance, not by denying God outright, but by slowly adjusting truth to fit the moment. But clarity will whisper something stronger. Compromise does not bring peace, it brings confusion. Obedience may bring pressure, but it also brings alignment. And alignment brings peace that pressure cannot take away. As pressure increases, believers will be forced to decide where their authority comes from. Is it culture? Is it emotion? Is it majority opinion? Or is it God's word? For years, many have tried to blend all of these together, hoping they would not conflict. But pressure will expose that they often do. And in that exposure, clarity will emerge. God's word will no longer be one voice among many. It will become the foundation again. Not because it is popular, but because it is stable. Not because it feels good, but because it is true. When everything else shifts, truth stands still. Pressure will also clarify priorities. Time will feel more valuable. Energy will feel more precious. Believers will stop wasting spiritual strength on things that do not matter. Faith will become less about appearance and more about endurance, less about performance and more about perseverance. Prayer will change under pressure. It will become less polished and more honest, less scheduled and more urgent, less about presentation and more about dependence. When pressure increases, people stop pretending. They start praying, and Scripture will change too. It will no longer be read only for inspiration, but for survival. Verses will be clung to, not quoted casually. Promises will be trusted, not just admired. Truth will move from the page into the heart because it has to. One of the greatest lies believers must reject in this season is the idea that pressure means failure. Pressure often means preparation. God does not prepare his people by removing resistance. He prepares them by strengthening resolve. He does not train his people for battle and comfort. He trains them in endurance. And as clarity increases, believers will begin to recognize the difference between unity and compromise. Unity is built on truth. Compromise is built on fear. Pressure will tempt the church to confuse the two, but clarity will remind believers that love does not require the abandonment of truth, and truth does not require the absence of love. This clarity will also bring courage, not loud courage, not aggressive courage, but quiet, steady courage, the kind that does not need to announce itself, the kind that shows up consistently, the kind that remains faithful even when results are unseen. Believers will learn that courage is not the absence of fear, it is obedience in spite of it. And pressure will teach that lesson better than comfort ever could. There will be losses in this season, opportunities missed because conviction said no, relationships strained because truth was spoken gently but firmly, doors closed because integrity would not bend, and those losses will hurt. Faith does not numb pain, but clarity will help believers understand that not every closed door is a tragedy. Some are protection. Pressure will reveal what believers are building their lives on. If it is approval, pressure will crush it. If it is comfort, pressure will steal it. If it is God, pressure will strengthen it. Storms do not create foundations, they reveal them. And as clarity increases, believers will begin to see that following God was never about safety. It was about faithfulness. Never about control. It was about trust. Never about avoiding hardship. It was about enduring it with hope. The pressure of the coming days will strip away distractions and expose devotion. It will remove illusions and reveal intentions. And while that process may feel uncomfortable, it will be deeply refining because clarity brings confidence, not in self, but in God. When you know where you stand, you stop being tossed around by every opinion. When you know whom you trust, you stop needing constant reassurance. When you know what you believe, you stop being easily shaken. This clarity will not make believers arrogant, it will make them humble. Not defensive, but grounded. Not fearful, but anchored. They will understand that faith does not promise escape from pressure. It promises strength within it. And as pressure continues to rise, believers will discover something surprising. The same pressure meant to silence them will actually strengthen their witness, not through arguments, but through endurance, not through volume, but through consistency. A life lived with conviction under pressure speaks louder than any speech ever could. The world may not agree with believers, but it will notice them. It will notice peace that does not make sense, integrity that does not bend, hope that does not collapse, and clarity that does not waver. Because when pressure increases and clarity sharpens, faith stops being fragile and starts being formidable. And in that clarity, believers will stand, not because the pressure is gone, but because the truth has never been clearer. And as this pressure increases and clarity sharpens, something else will inevitably begin to shift. Something closer to home, something deeply personal for every believer who has ever called the church their place. The church itself will change, not in its foundation, not in its message, not in its mission, but in its posture. What has long been centered on comfort will be forced to return to commission. What has been built around convenience will be reoriented toward calling. And for many, this will be the most uncomfortable adjustment of all. For a long time, church life has been shaped by what people want rather than what God requires. Services designed to be appealing, messages shaped to be agreeable, schedules built to be manageable. None of these things are evil in themselves. But over time, something subtle happens. The church begins to exist for the believer rather than the believer existing for God's mission. Faith becomes something you attend instead of something you live. And when that happens, comfort quietly replaces commission. But seasons of pressure don't allow that version of the church to survive. When following Christ costs something, you no longer ask, "What do I like?" You ask, "What am I called to do?" And that question changes everything. The church was never meant to be a refuge from responsibility. It was meant to be a training ground for obedience, a place where believers are equipped, strengthened, corrected, and then sent. Sent into workplaces, families, communities, and conversations as representatives of Christ. Comfort may fill seats, but commission changes lives. As cultural resistance increases, churches will be forced to decide what they exist for. Are they gathering places for affirmation or launching points for mission? Are they centers of convenience or communities of conviction? Pressure will not allow neutrality. It will demand direction. Programs that once felt essential will begin to feel secondary. Attendance-driven success will lose its shine. The question will no longer be, did people enjoy it? But did people grow? Not was it impressive, but was it faithful? And while this shift may feel like loss at first, it is actually a return to purpose, to power, to identity. The early church did not grow because it was comfortable. It grew because it was committed. Believers gathered not to be entertained, but to be strengthened. They prayed not out of habit, but out of desperation. They shared not because it was convenient, but because it was necessary. And they went into a hostile world, not armed with influence, but with obedience somewhere along the way. Many churches traded that urgency for ease. Mission became optional. Sacrifice became rare. Commitment became negotiable. But pressure has a way of restoring priorities. When the world becomes more hostile to faith, the church becomes more dependent on God, and dependence always leads back to commission. This shift will also change leadership. Leaders will no longer be evaluated primarily by charisma or popularity, but by faithfulness and courage. Shepherds will be required to guide, not just comfort, to warn, not just encourage, to speak truth gently but clearly, even when it risks misunderstanding. And those who are called by God will rise to that responsibility, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. For the believer, church will stop being a place you attend when it fits your schedule and start being a community you belong to because it shapes your life. Commitment will deepen. Accountability will matter again. Discipleship will move from theory to practice. The church will rediscover that it exists not to mirror culture, but to model a different way of living, not to echo popular opinion, but to embody eternal truth. And that realization will cost something. Comfort always has to be surrendered before commission can be embraced. There will be fewer spectators and more servants, fewer consumers and more contributors, fewer people asking, "What do I get?" and more asking, "Where am I needed?" And that shift will feel uncomfortable to those who preferred faith without responsibility. But it will feel freeing to those who were made for purpose. Mission will no longer be something supported from a distance. It will become something lived daily. Evangelism will not be a program. It will be a posture. Service will not be an event. It will be a lifestyle. Faith will move out of the building and into the streets, the offices, the schools, and the homes. Prayer will move to the center again, not as a transition, not as a formality, but as a lifeline, because when the church realizes it cannot rely on culture, influence, or acceptance, it will return to the only source that has ever sustained it, God Himself. And something beautiful will happen in that return. The church will become less impressive but more powerful, less polished but more authentic, less visible in headlines but more active in lives. The world may stop applauding, but heaven will take notice. This shift from comfort to commission will also refine motives. People will stop attending church to feel better about themselves and start following Christ to become more like Him. Faith will no longer be about maintaining a lifestyle, but about fulfilling a calling. And yes, some will walk away when the cost becomes clear. They were drawn to comfort, not commission. But those who remain will be transformed. They will discover that obedience carries a joy that comfort never could. That purpose satisfies in ways convenience never will. The church was never meant to be a cruise ship. It was meant to be a rescue mission, and rescues are messy. They are risky. They are demanding, but they matter. As this shift takes place, believers will begin to understand that their faith was never supposed to fit neatly into their lives. It was meant to redefine them, to interrupt routines, to reorder priorities, to call them out of safety and into significance. The church will once again become a place where people are equipped to endure, not escape, where truth is spoken with love and lived with courage, where faith is strengthened for the road ahead, not softened for comfort's sake. And when that happens, the church will not fade. It will focus. It will not weaken. It will deepen. It will not retreat. It will advance quietly, steadily, faithfully. Because when comfort gives way to commission, the church finally becomes what it was always meant to be. And as the church shifts from comfort to commission, another transformation will take place, one that reaches into the most personal spaces of a believer's life. Faith will move from public approval to personal obedience. For many years, it has been possible to live a kind of visible Christianity, one that looks convincing on the outside and feels acceptable on the inside, largely because it was affirmed by the culture around it. But the days ahead will quietly remove that support. Applause will fade, approval will thin, and when that happens, every believer will face a defining question: who am I obeying when no one is affirming me? Public approval has a subtle power. It makes faith feel validated. It reassures us that we are on the right side of history, the right side of opinion, the right side of the moment. But approval is a fragile foundation. It shifts with trends. It bends with pressure. It disappears when obedience becomes inconvenient. And faith built on approval cannot survive seasons that demand courage. What is coming will require a different kind of strength, the strength to obey God when obedience is unseen, uncelebrated, and sometimes misunderstood. Faith will no longer be sustained by recognition, but by conviction. Believers will learn what it means to follow God, not because it looks good, but because it is right. This shift will be deeply personal. It won't always show up in dramatic public moments. More often it will appear in quiet decisions no one else notices. Choices made in private. Convictions upheld when no one is watching. Integrity practiced when shortcuts would be easier. These moments will define faith more than any public declaration ever could. For many, this will be the hardest adjustment. It is one thing to stand for God when it earns respect. It is another thing to stand for God when it costs it. Public approval makes obedience feel rewarding. Personal obedience requires trust. Believers will discover that faith was never meant to depend on affirmation. Jesus never promised applause. He promised presence. He never guaranteed acceptance. He offered faithfulness. And in the days ahead, that difference will matter more than ever. As approval fades, motives will be exposed. Some will realize they were following God as long as it fit comfortably with their identity, reputation, or relationships. When obedience threatens those things, hesitation will appear. Silence will feel tempting. Compromise will feel reasonable. But personal obedience understands something deeper. God sees what others do not. Faithfulness that is unseen is never unnoticed by Him, and obedience offered in secret often produces the greatest strength in public. This shift will redefine what it means to be faithful. Faith will no longer be measured by how confidently someone speaks about God, but by how consistently they live for Him, not by how visible their beliefs are, but by how deeply those beliefs shape their choices. Believers will stop asking, "How does this make me look?" and start asking, "Does this honor God?" And that question will guide decisions in relationships, finances, careers, and daily conduct. It will influence what is said and what is left unsaid, what is pursued and what is resisted. There will be moments when obedience feels isolating, when standing firm makes you feel like you're standing alone, when silence would preserve peace, but truth requires courage. In those moments, personal obedience will feel heavy, but it will also feel honest, because there is a peace that comes from alignment, a peace that approval can never provide. Faith that depends on approval is exhausting. It requires constant adjustment, constant monitoring, constant reassurance, but faith rooted in obedience is freeing. It anchors you to something anging. It releases you from the need to be constantly affirmed. As believers walk this path, they will discover that obedience is not about proving devotion. It is about trusting God's wisdom over their own comfort. It is about believing that God's ways are right even when they are difficult. And that trust grows stronger every time obedience is chosen over ease. This season will also teach believers the difference between visibility and faithfulness. Not every act of obedience will be seen. Not every stand will be recognized. Not every sacrifice will be acknowledged, but God does not measure faith the way people do. He measures the heart. Some of the strongest believers in the days ahead will be those whose faith is quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. They won't be loud. They won't seek attention. They will simply live in obedience day after day, decision after decision. Personal obedience will reshape priorities. Time will be spent differently. Resources will be used intentionally. Relationships will be navigated with wisdom rather than impulse. Faith will become less reactive and more deliberate. And this obedience will not be driven by fear, but by love. Not by obligation, but by surrender. Believers will obey not because they are afraid of consequences, but because they trust the one they are following. There will be a temptation to believe that obedience without approval is wasted, but the opposite is true. Obedience offered without recognition is often the most powerful testimony. It demonstrates that faith is real, that it is not dependent on applause, but on allegiance. This kind of obedience builds spiritual resilience. It teaches believers how to remain faithful even when circumstances shift, how to stand firm when opinions change, how to trust God when the path ahead feels uncertain. And as believers grow in personal obedience, something beautiful will happen. Confidence will replace anxiety. Not confidence in self, but confidence in God. When you know you are obeying Him, you stop needing constant reassurance from others. Faith will become less about image and more about intimacy, less about being seen and more about being known by God. And that intimacy will sustain believers through pressure, opposition, and uncertainty. Public approval can disappear overnight. Obedience cannot. Approval fluctuates. Obedience anchors. Approval flatters. Obedience transforms. And in the days ahead, those who choose personal obedience over public approval will discover a deeper strength, a steadier faith, and a quieter courage than they ever thought possible. Because when applause fades and approval disappears, obedience remains, and it will be enough. And as believers learn to choose obedience without applause, another shift will take place, one that may be the most humbling and yet the most strengthening of all. A deeper dependence on God will replace human security. Things that once felt stable will begin to feel uncertain. Systems that once seemed reliable will reveal their limits. Voices that once sounded confident will falter. And in that unraveling, believers will come face to face with a truth that has always been there, but rarely felt so clearly. Everything that is human is temporary, but God alone is unshakable. For a long time, many believers have lived with layered security. God was part of the foundation, but not always the center. There were backup plans, financial stability, social acceptance, institutional protection, familiar routines, trusted structures. None of these are wrong in themselves. But when they quietly become the source of confidence, dependence shifts without us even realizing it. Faith becomes supplemented rather than central. What is coming will gently but firmly strip away that illusion, not to leave believers helpless, but to draw them closer. Because God has never competed well with substitutes. He allows them until they fail. And when they do, His purpose is not to frighten His people, but to remind them who has been sustaining them all along. This deeper dependence will not begin in dramatic moments. It will begin in quiet realizations, a sense that what once felt solid now feels fragile, a recognition that answers are not as easy as they used to be, a growing awareness that control was always more assumed than real. And in that space, believers will be invited, not forced, to lean more fully on God. Dependence is uncomfortable for those who value control. It feels like vulnerability. It feels risky. It feels uncertain. But spiritually, dependence is not weakness. It is alignment. It is the posture faith was always meant to take. Scripture has always made this clear, but comfort allowed us to overlook it. Strength comes from reliance. Wisdom flows from surrender. Peace grows out of trust. And when human security begins to fail, believers will rediscover the power of daily dependence on God. Prayer will change in this season, not because believers are more spiritual, but because they are more aware of their need. Prayer will move from being scheduled to being continual, from being polite to being honest, from being informational to being relational. People will pray not because they should, but because they must. And in that dependence, prayer will stop feeling like a ritual and start feeling like breath. Something you cannot skip without consequences, something essential, not optional. Because when human support weakens, divine support becomes vital. Trust will deepen too, not the vague kind of trust that says, I believe God can, but the resilient kind that says, I believe God will sustain me even if the outcome is not what I expect. This kind of trust does not remove fear instantly, but it steadies the heart in the presence of it. Believers will begin to understand that faith was never meant to guarantee predictability. It was meant to anchor hope. God does not promise a clear map. He promises His presence. And when dependence deepens, presence becomes enough. This shift will expose how often security was drawn from things that felt spiritual but were actually structural. Church routines, familiar leaders, established patterns. None of these are bad, but none of them were ever meant to replace dependence on God Himself. When those structures are shaken, believers will feel disoriented at first, but that disorientation will lead to rediscovery, a rediscovery of what it means to seek God personally, to listen for His voice, to trust His timing, to obey without full understanding. There will be days when answers do not come quickly, when clarity feels delayed, when waiting becomes the discipline. And in those days, dependence will grow roots. Faith will mature, because trust that survives silence is deeper than trust built on constant reassurance. This deeper dependence will also bring Humility, believers will stop assuming they understand everything God is doing. They will become more patient with mystery, more gentle with others, more aware of their own limitations. And humility will open the door to grace in new ways. Security built on human strength often produces pride without realizing it. Security built on God produces gratitude. Every provision feels intentional. Every step forward feels guided. Every moment of endurance feels sustained. As dependence deepens, believers will stop asking God to bless their plans and start asking Him to shape them. Control will give way to submission. Anxiety will slowly give way to trust, not because circumstances improve, but because confidence shifts. And here is the paradox of dependence. The more believers rely on God, the stronger they become. Not stronger in self-sufficiency, but stronger in resilience. They will endure things they once thought would break them. They will face uncertainty without collapsing. They will walk forward without having all the answers. Human security promises stability, but it cannot deliver it. God never promises stability. He promises faithfulness, and faithfulness outlasts every structure. This dependence will also reshape how believers view success. Success will no longer be measured by comfort, predictability, or control, but by faithfulness, obedience, and endurance. A good day will be defined not by ease, but by trust. And in that redefinition, peace will grow, not the fragile peace that depends on everything going right, but the deep peace that remains when everything feels uncertain. The peace that comes from knowing you are held, even when you do not know what is ahead. Believers will learn to release the illusion that they must figure everything out. Dependence will teach them to take each day as it comes, to trust daily provision, to rely on daily grace, to walk step by step instead of demanding the full picture. This kind of faith does not shout. It does not rush. It does not panic. It waits, it listens, it obeys, and it stands. When human security fades, some will feel exposed, but those who lean into dependence will feel strengthened. They will discover that God was not removed from their supports. He was beneath them all along. And as this deeper dependence takes root, believers will find themselves steadied by something the world cannot give and cannot take away. Because when everything else proves uncertain, God remains, and He is enough. And when believers have been separated by conviction, refined by pressure, redirected from comfort to commission, anchored in personal obedience and stripped down to a deeper dependence on God, something remarkable begins to emerge, something the world cannot manufacture and cannot extinguish. Hope rises, not shallow optimism, not denial of reality, but a steady, resilient, unshakable hope that becomes the believer's loudest testimony. This hope will not come from circumstances improving. In many cases, circumstances may remain uncertain, even difficult, but hope does not need ideal conditions to exist. Hope is born when faith sees beyond what is visible and trusts what is eternal. And in the days ahead, that kind of hope will stand out more than ever. The world is growing tired of empty promises. It has heard optimism that collapses at the first sign of trouble. It has watched confidence fade when control is lost. And it has felt the weight of fear that keeps offering answers but never delivers peace. In that environment, hope that endures will speak louder than arguments ever could. Believers will not be the loudest voices in the room, but they will be the steadiest. They will not pretend everything is fine, but they will refuse to believe everything is lost. And that refusal will be noticed. Hope will become visible not in slogans, but in lives, in the way believers respond to uncertainty without panic, in the way they endure hardship without bitterness, in the way they love without conditions, in the way they forgive when resentment would be easier, in the way they continue to trust God when explanations are incomplete. This hope will not ignore pain. It will outlast it. It will not deny fear. It will walk through it. And because it is rooted in something deeper than circumstances, it will remain when circumstances change. Believers will begin to understand that hope is not wishful thinking. It is confident waiting, waiting with expectation, waiting with trust, waiting with the assurance that God is at work, even when progress is invisible. This kind of hope is forged in pressure. It is strengthened by obedience. It is sustained by dependence. And once formed, it becomes contagious. People around believers will notice something different. Not perfection, not certainty about every outcome, but a peace that does not make sense, a calm that does not match the chaos, a confidence that does not rely on control. And that difference will invite questions, not questions about beliefs alone, but questions about source. How are you still standing? Why are you not afraid? What keeps you steady? And in those moments, hope will speak, not through rehearsed answers, but through lived faith. Hope will also reshape how believers talk about the future. Instead of fear-filled speculation, there will be trust-filled expectation. Instead of despair, there will be anticipation. Not because believers know exactly what will happen, but because they know who will be with them no matter what happens. This hope will be humble. It will not boast. It will not claim superiority. It will not look down